All right, we're going to go through some of the develop module settings in Lightroom. We're really going to focus in on luminosity and tone today for those. So we have all of our images. These actually have all now been converted to DNGs. And so we have our DNG images. And you may remember, just real quick, that we set up Lightroom before to save an XMP file next to each RAW file. And so any of these RAW files that had ratings or anything done to them, an XMP file has been saved. But now that we've created DNGs out of them, it will no longer save those XMP files separately. They will be within the DNG package. So let's bring up one of these images. I'm going to grab this image and we're going to go into the develop module. You can see when we get in the develop module, it looks very similar to the library module, with the exception that there's no folders over here. We now have presets that we can choose different presets to have our image look a certain way. I tend to not go for too many of the presets. I like to make the settings myself, but you can see as I scroll over them, it sort of applies them to my image or previews them on my image. We'll talk about presets at a later time, but right now I just want to kind of point out that they're there. You can take a snapshot to compare back to a certain area or a time that you adjusted your image. And you can see that it keeps a running history of everything we've done to this image, from importing it to exporting it, and then any of these develop settings that we're going to apply to it. And so you can go back to any phase or any point in the retouching you've done. And we also see our collections here, which is nice. This is why we talked about collections, because we can put them in there and then we can access them later if we need to in the different modules. We still have our film strip along the bottom with our previews of all the images, and we can kind of move through image by image and see what's going on in them. We have loop view as one of our viewpoints up here, and we have a reference image and the adjusted image that we can put up. So we can drop an image there and then use this side to match it to that other image. We have a before and after, which will show us what our image looked like before we did any settings and what it currently looks like as we're doing the settings. And I'll show you that as we go. But we're going to kind of stay in the loop view for right now. We still have our histogram up here, but you notice now that as I scroll over my histogram, it highlights different sections. And as it highlights those sections, you'll see those areas light up down here. So like when I go over the exposure slider, that center section of the histogram lights up. And when I go over the highlights, that area just to the right of center lights up. And when I go over shadows, just to the left, and the whites are the extreme rights of the histogram and the blacks are the extreme lefts of the histogram. We also have on the histogram these little triangles up here, and these are our clipping triangles. So if I click on this triangle here, it will turn on my black point clipping, and I'll leave it on so you can see. And if I turn this one on over here, it'll turn on my white point clipping. So if I were to adjust my exposure down, everything that has a blue pixel on it is clipped to pure black. That's the black point clipping that's right here. And if I turn that off by clicking on that triangle again, you can see that just by scrolling over it will bring up that clipping. And now if I move my exposure the other direction, the red pixels that are showing up are my white point clipping. And the same thing is true. I can turn off that triangle, and if I scroll over it, it will show me those clipping points. To reset this exposure slider back to 0, all I need to do is double click on exposure, the word exposure, and it'll reset it. So what we're really going to be talking about today is this tone section here, or the luminosity. This is sort of where we deal with the brightness and the contrast of our image. And that's all we're really going to touch on today. There'll be more develop module demos where we'll get into more of the settings in the develop module. There are a ton of settings that get pretty deep, pretty fast. So I just wanted to kind of start with these, and you can go through and look at some of your images and make some of these basic adjustments so that you can make your images look a little bit better. So these are some of those decisions that you have to make about your images, right? You're creating this image. You have a vision for this image. You need to make decisions about exactly how you want this image to look. So let's look at this image. This is a fairly contrasty scene. And because of that, we have very little detail in the shadows, and the highlights are just blocking up. We can see just a little bit down here on the top of that sign there in that window where it says Joyride, is that we're getting that red clipping that's showing up there. In other words, our image is going pure white in that area. So we want to be aware of that. I don't see anywhere that's pure black. Now, it doesn't mean it's wrong that there's pure black or pure white in an image, because images have pure white and pure black. I know that the paint or the signage on that window is a metallic surface, and the light is coming from down the street, and so the sunlight is reflecting off of that surface and back into the camera, which is clipping it to pure white. And so that would be a pure white area of my image. So we're going to talk about how we're going to make adjustments. So I'm going to look at this image and I'm going to say, well, first of all, I think the shadows are too dark and the highlights are a touch bright. So I'm going to try a contrast move first. So if I move to the right, I increase my contrast. You can see the clippings coming in. If I move to the left, I decrease my contrast. Well, there's my shadows opening up and my highlights are coming down a little bit, but now the whole thing just looks gray. It just looks sort of not inviting, not intriguing. So I'm going to reset that, and I'm going to look and see if maybe just adjusting exposure up. No, that brightens my highlights too much. So I'm going to just try moving the shadow slider to the right and opening the shadows up. And you can see that as I do that, you can even watch the histogram up above. It's affecting the shadow area, that area that's highlighted in my histogram, just in from the left side of the image, but not into the center of it. It's just doing those shadow tones. And it's brightening those up, and it's doing kind of a good job of that. And now I'm going to deal with the brightness on that building and maybe try to bring that highlight clipping off of the Joyride sign down there. And so I'm going to take my highlight slider, I'm going to slide it to the left. And you can see that by doing that, I bring a little bit more detail into this area on the building, right? So you can see if I reset that, you can see how bright that building is. You can even see that clipping a little bit on that street light. And as I slide my highlight slider down, it's adding a little more detail into those bricks, and it's kind of reducing that white spot on the street light, although I'm not super worried about that because that is also getting a direct reflection of the sun. So I think that looks pretty good for opening them up and bringing the highlights down. But now I can see on my histogram up here that I've sort of lost the deep dark blacks that were in my image. And so I'm going to take my black slider, and if I slide it to the left, it's going to increase the amount or the amount of black in my image. And you can see that if I slide it all the way over, there's going to be a lot of black clipping. And so I can bring this back. Another way that I can do this and see the clipping is if I hold down the Option key. So I hold down the Option key and I slide my slider. Everything that shows up as black in that image is going to be pure black. And so this is how I usually do it. And I'll slide it and I'll say, I can see there's certain areas that are black. And now you can see where they were showing up. They're blue now. And looks like the tire underneath the car and that spot just that would be pure black. And I'm okay with that. And I'll undo the blacks moves and go back to the highlight. And you can see sort of the subtle little difference that it made in those shadows. Let me turn off the clipping so you can really see it. It's a very subtle move, but it just makes the shadows a little more rich. I can do the same thing with my white slider, holding down Option, and anything that's pure white, if I slide to the right, you'll see, is going to be pure white in my image. And so I can use this to maybe adjust those highlights down just a touch so that there's just a couple of little spots. Now, I've done this. I think the whole image may look just a touch dark now. And so I'm going to take my exposure slider and I'm just going to slide up my exposure just a little bit. And it sort of reopened up the image a little bit and kind of brightened things up. So you can see I made an extreme move on my shadows, and that's because my shadows were very dark. And if I look at it now and say, maybe they're a little bit too bright, I can always slide that shadow slider back down. Remember, Lightroom is a non-destructive editing tool, which means we can continually adjust all of this. and keep kind of circling back around until we get it into just the exact space that we want it to be. I think that's maybe a little dark. I'm going to open it up just a touch and maybe bring in just a little bit more of the deep, rich blacks. I think that I'm kind of getting a nice feel to the image now. And so you can see if I go to the before and after, there's what it looked like before, and now there's what it looks like. And you can really kind of see that difference, and I think it makes quite a difference in the image. If I didn't want to use my before and after down here, then I could just hit the backslash key, which is the key right over the return key. I'm going to go back into loop mode. And if I hit that key, you can see up here, it now says before, and it's showing me my before, and then I can toggle back and forth between my before and after. This can be really helpful to see the difference that you've made as you make these adjustments. One of the things that I learned kind of early on is that if you make little tiny adjustments and you do a whole bunch of little tiny adjustments, your eye will actually adjust to what it sees on the screen as you're doing that, and you may not see the changes that you're making. Sometimes it's a better idea to go a little bit extreme and then bring it back, and your eye will be better able to see that difference. The other way you can do it is you can bring it into loop mode and do the before and after so you can really kind of see. I mean, when I first looked at this image, I didn't think that there was too much going on or blown out on those bricks. But now that I've brought those highlights down, I can see all of that detail that's coming in. And so I think that that's a good move to make. So again, these are decisions you're going to make about your images, and you're going to have to kind of go through and make those adjustments. But those are the basic tone luminosity adjustments in Lightroom. One more thing that I'm going to show you real quick is I can go back in my history, and I can go all the way back to where I was at the beginning. If I didn't want to go through it in my history, there's a button in the lower right down here that says reset. And I'm going to reset this real quick. And then I'm going to show you, and by resetting, it keeps all those other moves that I made in there. And I could actually create a snapshot of this. I'm going to call it manual moves or adjustments. And I'm going to create that snapshot. So now you can see I have my manual adjustment snapshot. I'm going to go back into my reset settings, and I'm going to show you this button here, which is the auto button. So if you don't really know where to kind of start on your image, you can hit the auto button, and Lightroom will evaluate your image, and it'll make settings that it thinks makes the image look better. Now it's going to get into this presence setting down here, and I'm going to take those off for right now because we haven't talked about those. We'll talk about those next week as we dive a little bit deeper into our images and start to talk about color and other things. But you can see that there's Lightroom's move. And if I go to my snapshot, I can see what my move is. And so Lightroom actually sort of kept the shadows just a little bit darker. So I'm going to make a snapshot of this so that I can go between them. And I'm going to call this auto adjust. And so now you can see I have my manual adjustment snapshot and I have my auto adjustment snapshot, and I can compare those two. And I can see that I tended to make the shadows a little bit brighter, and Lightroom darkened those shadows a little bit. The nice thing about auto is that it actually sets the sliders. It doesn't just change your image. It changes the settings of your image so that you can go back and say, no, I really do like those shadows a little brighter, and I can just move those shadows a little bit brighter. Again, non-destructive editing. It lets us kind of move back and forth and go around and see all the different things that we can do. So that is the tone and luminosity adjustments in Lightroom.